Welcome to Everything is Final Fantasy. I'm Drew Kreisman, and in just a moment I will be joined by my brother Ira Kreisman and one of our favorite Final Fantasy content creators in the entire world, author MJ or Mo Gallagher. For those of you who don't know, and I can't imagine there's too many people listening to this who don't, Mo is the author of a pair of Final Fantasy books, one about the Greek myths that inspired Final Fantasy VII, and one about the Norse myths that inspired Final Fantasy VII. I cannot recommend them more highly, and you can find them on Amazon or wherever else you get your books. I also really want to recommend that everybody go and follow Mo or MJ. You'll find him as MJ Gallagher on all the social media stuff. He does semi-regular book giveaways and things like that. So if this is something you're interested in, I know the holidays are right around the corner. A lot of people are buying presents this time of year. It's a great gift idea for that Final Fantasy fan in your life. Again, the Norse mythologies and Greek mythologies books are already out. He's also working on a book, and you'll hear us talk about this in the conversation around Final Fantasy XVI, called Mythos. So be on the lookout for that. I do want to get right to it, so one quick caveat or thing I suppose that I wanted to mention is that this conversation is both pretty long and we jump all over the place. So be prepared for that. Light spoiler warning for Final Fantasy 16 and 7, I guess, and a little bit the remake project. But don't worry too much about that. We don't dive too far into it, and, give yourself a break and drink some water if you want to throughout here, but I promise you it's going to be worth listening to the whole thing. All right, Mo, so excited to finally, and I really do mean finally, get to chat with you. I have been following you for a very, very long time, and we're going to dive into as much as we can, but I'm really hoping this can be the first of many conversations. Yeah. I do want to get, actually, I want to start with one thing I know you've done out there a lot, but we got to do origin stories. I got to know as quickly as you can how you got into Final Fantasy and then really writing about it and now, making it what you do.
Sure. Well, first of all, just before I start, I have loved your work for a few years now. I love just sort of sticking my headphones in and going out and about on my commute to work or just for a walk or whatever, and just listening to you guys speak about Final Fantasy, it is genuinely hand on heart one of my favourite things to do. I love your discussion. I love how intellectual and just thorough and passionate, and the tackling taboos, tackling nuances within games. It is. Yeah, I love your work. I'm so grateful to have you guys as part of the community, and thank you. And I am so delighted to be here, but honoured to be here because I've been an enormous fan of you guys. So it's it's almost like speaking to a celebrity for me.
That's how we feel. No, I feel like this is absolutely mutual.
Yeah, that's very sweet of you to say.
I'm thank you so much for having me on. To answer your actual question, I weirdly enough, I was not familiar with the concept of RPGs at all until Final Fantasy VII came along. I was kind of the demographic that they were maybe targeting there with the huge marketing drive that the Final Fantasy VII had in the West in particular. Originally, I got to know the game through a friend of mine who sort of picked it up. He was a bit more familiar, had been following the development, etc. He introduced me to the game. I thought this was fantastic. Before that, I effectively had been platformers, Sonic and Mario, and then moving on to Crash Bandicoot, things like that, and maybe some soccer games thrown in there as well. That was my sort of bread and butter up until
soccer, because you're talking to Americans. Was that
that was, yeah. I mean, I didn't want to sort of throw myself under the bus by saying football and confuse matters. But when Final Fantasy VII came along, I was 12 years old, and it was, that time of my life where I was starting to pay attention to, spiritualism, to, what was going on in the outside world, capitalism, environmentalism. And it really left its mark on me. So, having watched my friend play, I was determined that I was going to get my own copy, which would have been sort of mid 1998, I think. So it was maybe about 6 months after it released in the UK, because I think we were a few months behind you guys when it eventually came out in Europe.
And it was the first one to come to, and I have no idea what PAL regions means. It's a phrase that we've heard forever. Yeah. But that was right, because the first 6 weren't really available.
Yeah, I'm not actually sure, because I know that you guys got, was it 1, 4, and 6?
Yeah,
came to the US. So I don't actually know the answer to that in terms of what came out on the NES or the SNES over here, because I was just completely unaware of the series. After 7 was released, I remember there retrospectively being the release of 6 on the PlayStation, and then they did that anthology that had, I think it was Chrono Trigger and 4 together. Yeah. So we definitely got that one. But I didn't play them retrospectively. I sort of started with 7 and just moved up chronologically. But 7, it just sort of it gripped me, and it became, I'd never experienced anything quite like that in media before. Being a fan of movies or books or whatever, there's those were profound at times, but not quite life-changing the way that Final Fantasy VII was. And eventually, how the writing started was when I was around 15. My English teacher every weekend would kind of set his homework for just go away, write a few pages of whatever you want. He was just looking to sort of test or vocabulary, spelling, grammar, whatever. And I remember sitting at maybe 4 p.m. on a Sunday thinking, I should really get this homework done. But I happened to be playing Final Fantasy VII at the time, and it was specifically the scene where you first visit Rocket Town and you go to find Sid in the rocket. And I remember thinking, do you know what? There's dialogue in this, there's scenery that I can describe, there's some action. I'm just going to write down what I see. Just filled 3 pages of a jotter, handed that in as my homework, and got a high grade for it. So I was okay, that seemed to have gone okay. So it meant I could then justify to my parents that I was genuinely playing this for homework reasons.
It's for school, I think.
Yeah, obviously.
So I was thinking ahead. Yeah. So after actually doing this quite a few times, I realised that it was bringing me a lot of pleasure to do this, so I didn't feel as if it was homework anymore. And I decided that I was going to sit down and just reproduce the game in a sort of novelised format, as it were. I had a girlfriend at the time, and it was a way of maybe being able to share the game with her. She wasn't interested, That's I've throughout my years, all the kind of partners I've had, none of them have been gamers, none of them have taken an interest in. That's fine. I don't want to watch the shitty TV shows that they want to watch. Yeah. So I'm not going to feel bad about that. But I actually wrote a handwritten novelised version of Final Fantasy VII when I was 15, 16, and made it as far. I want to say Wutai. I'm pretty sure it was Wutai. It might even have been further. It might have been the Keystone that I got to. But it was that. Now,
with handwriting, did you have a word count on that? Or
I couldn't tell you. I mean, it was.
Right.
I actually found a handwritten version recently, a few months ago. It's with. I have no use for it, so I was effectively going to just throw it in the bin, but A good friend of mine who's been a fan and followed my work for years and years. She actually has her own bookshelf, or a bookshelf in her study dedicated to me. So I was like, okay, it's only fair that you get this. So luckily enough, it has not been thrown in the trash. It is still in existence. So shout out to Emma for that. But as time went on, I kind of realised that, I do get a lot of pleasure out of this. I do want to continue doing this, and it's not practical to do a handwritten version. So let's start again in a digitised one. And eventually I shared that on some, I don't know if you guys remember some of the forums that were going around, when the internet really started to become a kind of social space. And for me, it was, like in the build-up to Advent Children's release, I specifically remember, being part of this community. So Advent Children, I think, was 2005. So somewhere around 2003, 2004 is when I started to share this online, and it was well received, and, started to build a little bit of traction. And for me, it was just, just a hobby. It was just a bit of fun. I liked that people liked it, and I wanted to produce more for them, etc. But never really took it seriously. And when I was in my mid-20s, I went to live abroad for a year. And this is a really bizarre story, right?
Excellent.
So, I first went to visit Japan, then went to visit Thailand, then went to Malaysia, and I had a cousin who owned a soccer school over in Malaysia. So me and my friends sort of stayed there, and rather than continuing our travel plans, we extended the stay in Malaysia. So we thought, right, okay, our plan is to go to New Zealand, to go to Christchurch. So we finished up what we were doing in Malaysia, went to Singapore, flew to Brisbane, where we were delayed by a few hours in Brisbane, and then flew to Christchurch. And about 10 minutes from landing into Christchurch, the plane started ascending again. And the voice came over, the captain saying, listen, there's been an earthquake, we're going to have to divert. But no one reacted. And it turns out that because, New Zealand has a fair chunk of seismic activity, it's pretty common that happens. Like if there's an earthquake in the North Island, all the planes are diverted to the South Island and vice versa.
Oh, wow.
So, everyone was like, oh, okay, it's a bit inconvenient, but okay, that's fine. Except it turns out that was, I don't know if you remember the 2011 earthquake that flattened Christchurch.
Oh, right.
So basically, if we hadn't stayed in Malaysia, or if our flight hadn't been delayed, we would have been in city centre Christchurch when that happened.
Oh, wow.
So we were diverted up to Auckland, which is the other international airport on the North Island. And my friend and I were just, let's go and spend a bit of time doing our own thing for a while. But find work for accommodation. And you usually get, you could be a cleaner, you could work behind the bar, you could work in a reception of a hostel, go fruit picking, things like that. Okay, but there was an opportunity to go be a tour guide at a haunted prison.
Yes, excellent.
So, of course, I was like, yes, that's the one for me. So I travelled to a town called Napier, which had this historic prison that, again, Napier had been flattened in the 1930s by its own earthquake, and there were only a few buildings that had remained standing, and this was one of them. And the reason it had remained standing was because the native wood that it had been built from was really kind of resilient, and the prison itself was really quite warped. So you would kind of go down a corridor, but it was like being at a circus or a show. It was really bizarre. But I arrived at this prison to be a tour guide, and it turns out that it was owned by an elderly couple. The husband was kind of someone who'd grown up fairly locally, and he was really quite high up in the local Maori council. The wife was also from Glasgow in Scotland, which is where I come from. But,
what are the odds?
But I hadn't known that in advance. So she and I hit it off pretty well, and she learned that I'd been a writer, writing my Final Fantasy novelization, and asked me if I wanted to consider being a writer for a different business that she had. So I ended up being sent all over New Zealand, all over the east coast of Australia, all over North America, the Mediterranean, the Baltic. Basically the business was walking cultural tours for cruise ship passengers. So they would buy an MP3 device on the cruise ship, and it would come into port, and they would effectively go off the ship, and there would be a ready-made tour for them to walk around. Yeah. So my job was to visit the locations, learn about the locations, and write the tours, and then sort of project manage the production of these tours.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
So that all came about because obviously we'd been diverted from Christchurch, so it's one of these sort of I don't like to use the word fate in this, but it's one of these situations that like I met the mother of my daughter at this prison as well, so there's a whole kind of knock-on effect.
We like the phrase happy accidents. I like happy accidents.
Happy accident is a good way to put it. So it literally changed the direction of my life. And the reason for that is it finally kind of put me in a position where, writing wasn't a hobby anymore. It was actually, I can take this seriously. I can do this at a professional level. So when I returned to Scotland, at that point, I thought, okay, I'm going to see where this can take me. And through continuing with the novelization, through being involved with KuppelCon and sort of producing novels for them, to realizing that I had a passion for history and mythology, and a lot of that tied really neatly into the Final Fantasy universe, and that was really kind of enhanced through this the kind of the job that I had with the cultural tours, because the idea behind it, I had a sort of formula where I would look at the generic history of the location, and then I would look at perhaps some famous figures, or I would look at the sort of the native population. I would look at folk tales and local mythology. I would look at just historic landmarks, wartime, etc. And no matter where I was in the world, I started to realise that there was a common thread. And when I was learning about folktales and heroes or monsters or gods, so much of it I'd already encountered. Even just the name I'd already encountered in Final Fantasy. And it was at that point where I realised, okay, there's more to this than I ever realised. And that is how the Norse Myths book, that's where the origin of it came from.
That is an amazing story to get there. I think I first found you sometime during the novelization on like Facebook, maybe. Wow. I remember seeing the novelization and thinking that's an incredible idea, but I didn't know a lot of that story, so I appreciate you sharing that with us.
No, my pleasure. And sorry, that was a really long-winded way of getting to the answer.
That's great.
So I did want to ask you, obviously we want to encourage everyone to buy the books and read the books. And so we actually want to start with what's not in the books, or rather what we were talking about this a lot, like so much, because like sometimes I'll just read a sentence, I'll be like, that could have been a whole book, but I'm sure you have to rein yourself in all the time. And there's some stuff that has ended up on the cutting room table, as it were. Some things that you would love to have dived deeper into, but you've got to focus more, whether it's, on any other game. I know you're a big Final Fantasy VIII fan. I've seen some of that on social media, or any particular
element of the series, some things you've not been able to dive into as much as you've wanted to?
Oh man, how long do we have?
Yeah, I was going to say, if we thought the first answer was long.
Well, because book 2, the Greek myths book is twice as thick, right?
Yeah.
When you put them next to each other, how big is Mythos going to be? Do they grow exponentially until we've got...
So I've kind of learned my lesson a bit with the Greek myths one. Mainly because one of the things that I am notoriously bad for is that I go down far too many rabbit holes, and if I see a connection, I want to share that connection. And one of the things with Greek mythology is, in advance, I had the structure of the book that I wanted to write, and it was roughly around the same size as the Norse mythology one. But every time I kind of started delving deeper into each of those subjects, it just sort of grew arms and legs and took me down different paths. And in hindsight, that was always going to happen. Greek mythology is, volume-wise, it is so much greater than Norse mythology, but you've also got the best part of, 2 millennia of different authors, different writers retelling the same myths. So you'll get details in one version that you don't get in another, and and that itself can kind of take you down different rabbit holes. So as much as I absolutely loved putting the Greek myths book together, what it taught me is that exactly as you say, I have to rein myself in. I have to be very focused, and part of the, there are a few reasons for that. One is that there's almost too much content in the Greek myths book. So for a lot of readers, particularly casual readers, that's quite off-putting, and I get that. The second thing is that I think because of the success I had with the Norse mythology one, that I wanted to produce more content. I wanted to share all these ideas, but there are different layers of sort of speculation. So there's things that are very, very obvious that's not a coincidence. That is, the developers have injected real world mythology there. And then there's some where it's like, okay, I'm pretty confident that is a connection, although I can't verify it. And then there's ones where you're thinking, okay, the next step down there, that's a possible connection. But obviously, as you go on, you get into deeper speculation territory. I think one of the problems that I had with the Greek myths book is that some of it is more speculative than perhaps I should have gone or should have stuck with. But that's something that I can only learn through the process, So to answer the question about Mythos, it's not going to be that voluminous, simply because I want to make sure that the arguments that I'm putting forward are as strong as they can be, rather than sort of delving. Don't get me wrong. I will point out things of here's a possible connection. Here are other things to think about, but I'm not going to dedicate half a chapter to them, sort of thing. That's I've as I say, I've learned my lesson on that one. But the Greek myths one, it could have been even bigger, because originally it was supposed to contain the Trojan War stuff. Yeah. So the Kickstarter version has 3 chapters in it dedicated to the Trojan War. It doesn't even go into the Odyssey. It specifically sticks to content found in the Iliad and the Aeneid, and kind of looks at Sephiroth and Genesis and Injil. But there's when I kind of realised that when I start making comparisons with Homer's epics, there's another book's worth of content there. Yeah. So it doesn't make any sense for me to kind of spend additional time including that in the Greek myths book. So I kind of cut those chapters from the public release, and the full version of the book will come out at a later date. So there is so much content just from 7 alone that I want to talk about. Final Fantasy VIII, there's a good chunk of Norse mythology that I want to talk about. My editor is desperate for me to write about 14.
Ugh.
And
There's so much. Ooh.
You even.
so, I mean,
Yeah.
Well, and
exactly.
one of the things 14 does is draw upon Final Fantasy as an inspiration itself.
Mhm.
So that's something I'm curious about. When you're looking at, if I were to write a novel based upon whatever, insert pop modern MCU, right? Oh, I really want to pull, I want to do something similar to what MCU did. I'm going to be pulling from myth, legend, and folktale from around the world anyway, even if I don't know it, right? So when you're
Yeah.
talking about the connections, the deliberate connections, do you also think about some of those that they may not have understood it, but this is in the same tradition as whatever it might be?
Well, I did that. That was kind of one of the core arguments that I put forward, particularly for the Greek myth book, because the Norse mythology one, there are a number of things that are not necessarily hidden in plain sight, like the name of Midgard, the name of Nibelheim, the Odin materia, the Ragnarok swords, the Midgard Zolom thing, Fenrir in Advent Children.
Right.
These are all things that that's not necessarily metaphorical or symbolic of or just symbolism, with no real deep meaning behind it. Like when you start to peel back the layers, there is very deliberate reasons for using these names. But Kazushige Nojima, who is the lead scenario writer for the majority of the compilation, like his background is actually writing and directing video games about Greek mythology. So that it's, when you put that into context, this isn't someone who perhaps has a passing interest in the in mythology. This is someone who, for many years before joining Square, that was his professional writing career. So being able to kind of take that and say, look, there's when I'm identifying parallels, when I'm identifying connections between Final Fantasy and specifically from Final Fantasy VII onwards, because that was the first game that Nojima was part of. But it's not just that these names or these connections are, perhaps they could be coincidental, but when you kind of actually say, well, this is what Nojima did, that he knew exactly who these characters were, he knew exactly what the mythological context was, the chances are of that being a coincidence has now reduced quite dramatically.
Yeah, right. Well, and you mentioned in the intro to Greek mythologies, right? Like, it's hard to know how much Sakaguchi was or wasn't doing any of this on purpose. But to Ira's point, it's like, but we know he was into like Dungeons and Dragons, and therefore Tolkien, and you draw that line for us in the intro of the book, right? But then, the Star Wars influences, right? So if you're directly referencing Star Wars as the Final Fantasy people, well, you're also referencing King Arthur, and you're also referencing, right, all of this. So it's like, I love that in the book that sometimes you draw those for us too, that it's not just, here's how Gaia, okay, these are similar things. That's a word in Final Fantasy VII, that's a word in ancient Greek mythology, direct line. But sometimes it's like, well, that's more similar to, what was one? There's an early one you mentioned that it's like, you can tell the artwork is, the depiction is more, and that was something we were going to ask you about, when they'll just mess with mythology. You mentioned Hinduism, right? We know that Shiva, is not a blue ice lady in Hindu mythology. So sometimes they just are grabbing these ideas at random, and sometimes they're clearly very deeply researched. I imagine that makes some of your work difficult, intriguing.
It can be, but exactly as you said, and exactly as I was alluding to there, that because a lot of the Final Fantasy stuff is derived from Dungeons and Dragons, there's already a basis there. And then again, as Ira pointed out earlier, specifically with Final Fantasy 14, but also, in the Final Fantasies leading up to it, they do kind of at times rely on the existing Final Fantasy mythos. So while you are a couple of steps removed from the original mythology, you can still see, what the core of it was. And what I kind of like about, the kind of PlayStation era games and a little bit later is that because of Nojima's influence, they start to kind of twist the existing mythos, the existing Final Fantasy mythos, and reintroduce so it's kind of come full circle that they've gone from mythology, Dungeons and Dragons, Final Fantasy mythos, and then actually taken that and started to reintroduce the real world mythology again. So there's a good example of that is perhaps Odin. The Odin that appears in Nibelheim in Final Fantasy VII looks very similar to the Odin that has appeared throughout, or from Final Fantasy III onwards.
Yeah.
But he's then put in a town that is very closely associated with death. So while there are elements in the past, Odin in the mythology wasn't a sort of dark knight figure. He was more like a sort of wandering sorcerer, more like a Gandalf type. It's not entirely without foundation. As part of the Ragnarok myth, he does actually sort of get on his horse and put on his armor and that kind of stuff. He carries Gungnir, his spear, into battle. But when you get the kind of the Odin figure in Final Fantasy III, he appears in the catacombs below Saronia. So there's that kind of death aspect there.
Yeah. They're drawing on their own invented.
Yeah.
mythos,
So
yeah.
with Final Fantasy V and Final Fantasy VI, you kind of start to move away from that a little bit. Where in Final Fantasy VI he's in an ancient castle type idea. Mm-hmm. So there's a historic element, but not necessarily a mythology element. And then you bring Final Fantasy VII into play, where Nibelheim is very, very, very deliberately derived from Norse mythology. So you reintroduce Odin to the location that is already tied to Norse mythology, and you give him the element of death, which is the only summon that's associated with death. Not even Hades is actually associated with death in Final Fantasy VII. So
right,
there's actual genuine real world mythology elements there that they've kind of come full circle a bit.
Yeah, that stuff is I love those kinds of connections, man. That's why I love reading your stuff, and that's why it's really cool that we're getting to do this. We got to do a short one because this is going to make us take a little bit of a break, and then we'll come back on the on the other side of it. But I just along those same lines, are there any other? So we kind of sort of talked about some of the other games, but obviously, like you get to dive into one of the great, like there's such a the gods, the summons, like there's so much great stuff there. But I imagine you've been reading like a random item description and been like, man, why can't I do an entire chapter on this item or whatever? Like, what's the most random thing, or not the most, because I'm sure there's been a ton of them. But
God, yeah.
You've been like, man, why can't I do? Like you mentioned the Zeus ring at one point, and I was like, I forgot that even existed. Like, there's so many. Bacchus wine. Sometimes you forget that's even a reference, right? You're so used to it being a thing.
Just as a little teaser for the Final Fantasy 16 book, there's an entire chapter dedicated to the parallels between Clive and Dionysus specifically, both, but more from the angle of Dionysus was known as the kind of the liberator, who he took those who were most oppressed within society and kind of gave them freedom Because he's the dual aspect of alcohol. He was the god of merriment, but he was also the god of madness, and that's kind of where the Bacchus wine aspect comes from. Why it's associated with Berserk, because it's the followers of Dionysus went crazy through the wine.
One of my favorite single images from 16 is when Clive sees himself in that goblet of wine. That's so good.
So I don't know if you've kind of seen, Tyler Hepner did some artwork for the book, and one of the artworks is Clive sitting on a throne, but he's holding a goblet of wine, and the reason he's holding a goblet of wine is because of the Dionysus connection.
Fantastic.
But there are, if you kind of go out or through the story of the game, in the flashback, for example, Clive says, "No, I don't drink. I won't be in the hall while the men are being merry." And then he goes to Sid's hideaway, and Sid offers him a drink, and he refuses. And then eventually he accepts the drink. And then when the 5-year later time skip, he himself is the one pouring the wine. And all of this is to do with Clive's development and the connections to Dionysus as the god of the vine, and etc. But towards the end of the game, I think they mentioned it beforehand, but it actually shows up specifically in the Rising Tide DLC that they actually have Bacchus wine in it. It's a real thing from a different continent, but there are so many fun little allusions in there. So the whole point of Clive being the one to break the suffering of the bearers, and then break the suffering of mankind, by defeating Ultima and all that. It's very, very layered and deliberate. And
then he can buy everyone at Hideaway a drink.
It's one of my favorite bits.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Did you guys see the thing? Apparently, this was in the Ultimania, and I didn't realize this. I thought I'd cracked this. The Archimedes tub and crown thing. Okay, so basically the reason that the bar is called the Tub and Crown is that Archimedes solved the problem of how to measure weight. Was it weight or volume or density? I've forgotten now. It's gone out of my head. Basically, yeah. The king was trying to work out whether or not his unusual crown was made of gold. And Archimedes discovered that if you sit in a bath or sit in a tub of water, the mass of his body or the mass of the water that came out of the tub was equal to the mass of his body. So the tub and crown is named after Archimedes.
That's fantastic. Oh, that's one way to do your measurements.
Not bad at all.
All right. This recording device is going to force us to take a quick little break, but I hope you've got time to chat with us a little bit more.
Of course.
All right.
So we already had the example earlier of Shiva and not being of the Hindu faith. I don't think that I get to critique Square or Final Fantasy or have much of an opinion on the fact that Final Fantasy Shiva is not very much like the Hindu Shiva. And I also think about that when we talk about Red 13 or Nanaki and sort of the Western American, indigenous American myth, legend, and folktale. And a lot of those traditions are still religions practiced today. They are sacred beliefs today. And so I am curious about your thoughts on how to handle those sorts of situations when you've got sort of fictitious versions of current people's sacred or religious beliefs.
Yeah. Well, it's absolutely something that I have to be very conscious of. And I'm kind of the same boat that I don't think I'm qualified enough to make the call one way or the other as to what is appropriation, what is not appropriation, what is fictional, what is okay to get away with. So my my default stance is that I have to approach it as if, these are individuals or gods or myths that are currently treated as, a belief system that people practice. That even for many of us, figures from the Greek pantheon or figures from the Norse pantheon, are still worshipped by neo-pagans. We have figures, who, for most of us, Mesoamerican deities who a minority may still worship. There's others such as the Angra Mainyu or Ahriman enemy types that appear throughout Final Fantasy actually come from Zoroastrianism, which is the oldest continually practiced religion in the world. So I do take that side of things very seriously, and particularly I'm very careful with my words at any given opportunity, particularly because when you're writing the book, or if you're writing something online, once it's out there, it's never coming back. So you have to make sure that the way it's worded is respectful to anyone who is a believer of these faiths. And to an extent, I was as careful as I could in the wording, particularly the manner in which beliefs are practiced, but also even the tense in which I use the stories. I do take particular care, and it's something that I have to be very conscious of moving into the Final Fantasy 16 book in particular, because there is an awful lot of references to Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, Shinto as well, Taoism, a little bit of Zoroastrianism. So this is a different type of book in the way that I'm writing it, and I'm very conscious of that. And I think the reason, or one of the reasons that I wish to be respectful is I kind of was raised in a Catholic household. I'm sort of agnostic nowadays, but I was raised in a Catholic household, and whenever I'm writing about kind of spiritual matters, I have the kind of voice in the back of my mind of how would your mother feel about this. And also the artist for the book, Tyler Hittner, is a devout Christian as well. So I'm very conscious that there has to be a very definitive, what I'm writing about makes reference to religious or mythological content, but also that it's not insinuating that the creators have, are being blasphemous or disrespectful. There has to be very, very careful wording to point out the connections without, effectively just being disrespectful to anyone. So to answer your question, yeah, I don't think that Final Fantasy crosses the line too often. I think it toes the line sometimes.
Comes up to that line.
Sure, yeah.
I think a lot of it, I think a lot of it is perhaps historically, particularly during the 90s, I think much of the development team at Square were aiming to release games in the Japanese market, so we're perhaps not paying too close attention to how that might be received by Western audiences and the religious beliefs that Western audiences have. I think, particularly post Final Fantasy VII, that has changed a lot. I think Xenogears was perhaps the last time they got very close to the bone. Yeah. But even Xenogears, looks at things from a Gnostic perspective. A lot of the time, it's not necessarily a commentary on Christianity or modern Judaism. It's more kind of ancient ideas, I think. Right. Final Fantasy Tactics, that's
yeah,
it gets a bit hairy at times, but
Well, but
Although having said that, I'm depending on you. I've never played Final Fantasy Tactics, so my knowledge of the story is 90% through you guys and your podcast.
oh wow,
That's
that's a lot to put on us.
wild.
Well, I feel like tactics is taking, insofar as it's taking a position, it is saying that it is the corruption of the individuals, and there are people of faith who who are very good people. It's the ones who corrupt it to their own means.
Yeah.
Much like the politics and the money and whomever's got the most swords or the most wheat or has suffered the fewest floods.
Right.
Right. It's always whoever has the most gets to be the dictator again. And we've always, because we're Final Fantasy heroes, we've always got to fight against that.
Right.
Um,
But it's very similar to Final Fantasy X as well, I think, where it's like they almost view it more as the corruption of a power structure than I think they're interested in, like you were saying there, like poking at any specific modern religion. I think when people try to do that, they're maybe over-interpreting a bit. As much as I may agree with some of their perspectives or conclusions, it's like, no, I think when Final Fantasy is, they're not critiquing religion so much as they're critiquing zealots or people who use religion as a power structure to their own ends, as another means for to oppress people. And I think that's sort of where and then sometimes it's just totally, some of the references are totally random, like you mentioned early in the Greek book about how Bahamut, that comes from the Bible, right? But it's like a giant fish, and the king of dragons just comes from, I guess, Dungeon Dragon or whatever. So it's almost like you're not going to offend anyone, I guess, with that, because it almost feels like it's totally random appropriation, I guess. But more to, I think, your bigger point is a lot of the times, like, they're much more interested in just religion as another way in which people can be oppressed. Not that any specific religion, because I think you lose the point if you say one specific religion is oppressive and the others are not. It's like, I think you lose the point there, right?
Yeah. And from my personal experience, it's, faith in, for an individual, is a very powerful, very personal, and very positive thing. It's very rare that, on a kind of personal level, that it is used in a malicious way. Obviously the higher up the chain you go, and exactly as Ira pointed out, when those in power start to use or kind of bend the doctrine or beliefs, or just their authority on particular matters in the wrong way, and that's where I feel a lot of the problems come from, rather than necessarily the individual's faith or the teachings of the faith itself. Obviously, there are some exceptions to that, that very kind of extreme examples at times, but that's not the norm. That's the exception, I find.
And I think, we find so many heroes throughout Final Fantasy who are, I mean, you use the word faith, I think, which is a really great word for it, right? We know all Final Fantasy is about hope, right? And so we see that these people believe in sort of these things. So to get us back onto the games a little bit, and some of the stuff in the books, because we talk a lot about the gods, but you talk also about some of the like story structures, and I guess we'll stick with 7 since that's where you've done most of the work or whatever. But I'm particularly interested in your thoughts, and again, how much time do we have? As much as you'd like here, because you've written that, that there are hundreds, thousands of different versions of Hercules or Heracles, excuse me.
Yeah,
I read it properly in your book, and so we're obviously now in the midst of this remake rebirth project, and it's not complete yet. And as you know, there's a million fan theory, everything's going online, but just in terms of this idea of readapting, remaking your own work. Again, you're playing with your own mythos, your own mythology here. And what your sort of take is, both as a storyteller, but as someone who's seen these stories retold over and over again, I imagine you don't have all the same hangups that a lot of people might be about, well, you can't retell this, or you can't, you can't change things because, as you know, well, as you point out very early, for example, Hesiod and Homer do not tell it the same way.
Yeah.
So to you, I would imagine some of these changes are almost similar to that.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of a good way of putting it. I think for most storytellers, they don't tell a story just because they have a few characters that they want to share with you, or they've got the structure of a plot that is just, oh, here's a cool action idea, I want to go with that. Storytellers have a message that they want to share with you, and I think as humans, we are programmed to not listen to an important message if it's delivered very direct to us. We are more likely to go away and absorb it if it is delivered metaphorically through symbolism, etc. And I think storytelling has always had that purpose. Going back to ancient times where the hearth was so important because everyone. It was a communal thing, that was where you would socialise, that everyone would sit around the fire and you would get your entertainment, you would learn about those around you, you would learn about your past, your culture. But so much of that, up until, effectively, Homer was the first of the kind of the epic Greek poets to put these stories, or to write these stories down. But Homer is an entire question of itself, whether or not Homer even existed as a person, or whether or not Homer is the personification of a collection of people, or whether or not Homer did exist but multiple people contributed to the Iliad or the Odyssey. The Homeric question is an enormous part, and there's actually nothing to really indicate that the concept of the tale of the Trojan War was Homer's idea. It's actually far more likely that was an oral tradition that had been passed down for generations previously. But oral traditions, obviously come with artistic liberties for whoever it is that's retelling that particular myth at any given time. So it's likely,
and who they're telling.
Exactly. So with every generation, that's going to change. And then when you start adding in geography, when you start adding in varying languages, it just becomes a bit of a mess. So I've, over time, kind of realised that storytelling has always been about the core message, never about the details. But the caveat to that is that a lot of the details in the storytelling I like to use in my books to point out.
Yeah.
Because it's not to suggest that details are not important, but the point here is that there is a message that the storyteller is trying to deliver. And when it comes to the remake with Rebirth, I think what most of us, when we look at this, is that we can identify that this is a huge big shiny game with all different types of mechanics. It looks absolutely glorious, it plays glorious, it has a multitude of things to do, but we talk about story beats. For the most part, we can see that the same things are happening, we can see that the same messages are being conveyed. I think that's kind of the point, that when I think for those who are looking for a kind of rigid, everything that was in the original has to be there, the details have to be the same. I don't look for that. I think it would break my heart if the core message was different, if the importance of life, the importance of grief, the importance of friendship, the importance of the collective versus the singular, in terms of the group of friends being stronger than Sephiroth because he's alone, kind of thing. if they were to start changing those messages, that would affect me a lot more than the actual details of how they get there. So I would agree that this is as much as, you know, in modern times, the remake trilogy is perhaps new territory for a lot of people. This is effectively what humans have been doing with storytelling for millennia. So I personally don't have a problem with it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, they called it remake on purpose, and I know that has a specific connotation for video games or film, but it's even then it's always told differently. I mean, going back to the MCU example, they're telling the same stories, but in a different way and for a different audience and for a different time and with different artists. And I think that's great.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we've sort of been very gung-ho about this particular point for a long time, but I do think it is worth remembering that, to your point, Mo, the oral traditions go back, and that these stories are particularly tied to. So it would make sense. Now I get why people, not to dive into internet arguments, you know, the Final Fantasy had never redone, remade, gone backwards. You always go for, okay, I get all of that. And I also fully get the people who are like, where's mine for Final Fantasy 6 or for Final Fantasy 8? Like, I'm with those people. Like, I'm ready for all of that as well. But I do think, in a way, this remake project the genius of it has been that they've been able to kind of have their cake and eat it too on this question, right? It's like, yes, they're doing something they've never really done before, but because they're doing it so differently, they get away with, and I imagine as creators, back to your point, like as storytellers, they don't want to just do it the exact same. They did that already. Other than Sakaguchi, all these storytellers are the same guys. And so, yeah, I think they're entertaining themselves as much as they're entertaining us. And that's probably why it's so much fun.
Yeah. I get that, and I'm absolutely on board with you that it's... I personally have never seen another project quite like it, where it is simultaneously the same and different, and it is specifically designed to be that way. I think that, you know, both from a storytelling perspective and also from a development and marketing perspective, it is absolute genius, because it's the best way to capture the largest group of people. And of course, there's, you know, in a Venn diagram, there is going to be a bit of a crossover where some people are unhappy with, you know, they want one element or the other. They don't want both. I get that, you know, everyone's entitled to their own opinion. But I personally think the manner in which they've approached this is just about the most incredible way they could have done it. And I take my hat off to them for it.
I couldn't agree more. And while I'm preaching to the choir, getting the prior to preach to me, or whichever way, I'm not sure this is going, since we're on the subjects of the new ones, and this, I do want to plug the new book that you're doing that's coming out. We talked a little bit about 16 before, but I will say I thought about you several times while playing that game.
Well, thanks very much.
Yeah.
In a sexy way, I hope.
Yeah, right. Usually late at night. We played that game together.
For the first time in a long time.
A long time. And there were a couple of times where stuff was happening. We're like, oh, Mo was going to have a field day with this. Yeah. The imagery is overwhelming. But just in general, and obviously you were inspired enough by it to write your next book about it. But I'm really curious, because lots of people have lots of thoughts about that game.
Final Fantasy 16 is... for me, it was absolutely astonishing. My approach to games is I'm not a huge gamer. I'm very much plugged into the gaming community, but I'm not actually a huge gamer. So what I personally look for is story. I'm not too fussed about, you know, the gaming mechanics, or, you know, what the world map looks like or anything like that. I'm invested in the story, and I have never known a single piece of media to be so jam-packed with mythological references and religious allusions. It is, and one of the things, and I feel this way too, and I don't know about you guys, but one of the things that I've heard most about Final Fantasy 16 is that for those who loved it, they felt as if the game had been made for them personally.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And
that's how we felt.
This was for us specifically. Yes.
Yeah, it's astonishing that for such a wide variety of gamers with a wide variety of interests and things that they are looking for in the game, to actually be able to capture that for so many people is wonderful. But Final Fantasy 16 for me now actually has jumped up to second spot behind 7, and I lump everything to do with 7 and because it's not fair on the rest to do that. But it's overtaken Final Fantasy 8 as my second favourite. And I knew, even from the trailers, that I had a very good idea that this was something that would be right up my alley in terms of the mythology and the religion. And even playing the demo, I was, I will absolutely be writing a book about this. But I knew after the demo that was happening.
Wow.
But also from a really kind of personal perspective, I lost my grandmother 3 days before the game released, and I was very close with her, and being able to play that game and the messages within the game, and so much of it had that theme of death and rebirth and sort of moving on, and it came at the perfect time for me, because it really helped me with the grieving process, and just not just because it was a distraction, but also on a kind of spiritual level, being able to think about various things just by continuing through this game. So it was a really powerful game, really powerful story, and yeah, it ticked all the boxes for me. Obviously, I can get why it wasn't everyone's cup of tea, but one of the reasons that I'm writing the book is that I got so much out of the story because I understood the references. Mm-hmm. And I think if you're not invested in that side of it, there's so much that can be missed. And I want to, retrospectively be able to point out to people, here are things that perhaps might have enhanced your enjoyment of the game if you were aware of them at the time. So it's not just about celebrating Final Fantasy 16. It's not just about educating people on various different pieces of mythology or whatnot. It's actually about what can I do to help enhance other people's how they see the game. So I'm hopeful that for a number of people, they might think, okay, now I get it. Now I have a deeper appreciation.
Excellent.
What a way to learn that stuff too. Because, I mean, for me, books and video games were where I got all my vocabulary growing up.
Yeah.
That's why I have a wide vocabulary. I remember you had that example of panacea.
Yeah.
That you learned from Chrono Cross, right?
Yeah, I remember learning things like that, or knowing what the word idol meant, like in the second grade, because it was a status ailment you could get in Final Fantasy IV or something. Teacher's like, does anyone know what idol meant? It's like, yeah, you can't attack the enemy this turn.
So I like that you're doing that from sort of an educational perspective of, here are some connections that if you understand them, right, you might be able to see them in other places again. When I was still a regular English teacher, we talked about the hero's journey a lot, and then we would watch Miyazaki's Spirited Away and Disney's Lion King or whatever, and here, what do you see that's the same? What do you see that's different? So I really like how you're approaching that for Mythos.
Well, the hero's journey is actually a really it's an important point to touch on, because one of the core things that exists throughout the majority of the Final Fantasy games is that it does follow the hero's journey structure, which in turn is derived from global mythology. So I think the fact that mythology works so well within the Final Fantasy games is not really a coincidence because it follows that structure. So, yeah, it's when you kind of start to look, 7 and 16, of course, because in more recent times I've been focused so heavily on them. Cloud's story arc, kind of working his way into the live stream and coming back, and it's almost beat for beat.
Is Aerith the Obi-Wan?
Campbell's breakdown is
I guess
incredible.
Aerith is Obi-Wan in the. I was
Because she struck down.
Yeah. Strike me down now, and I shall become far more powerful than you could possibly imagine. Oh wow! No, sorry, that threw me way off. But in terms of like you mentioned, and we were kind of touching on that earlier, like the structure of the stories. I've thought a couple of times I'd really want to do an episode or a video on Final Fantasy and the hero's journey and Joseph Campbell, but it's like your editor saying you got to write a book about Final Fantasy 14. It's like, whoa. Okay, yes, cool, but where do you start? Because as you mentioned, the hero's journey is just it's everywhere, all over these stories.
Yeah.
I was starting to get into a little bit as I was reading, I think, to the kiddo today, about like you were talking about some of the trials, and like those. So our heroes obviously are always going through, certain trials, as Heracles, I'll say it properly, is known for doing, and those are some of the more, as you mentioned, there's certain connections here where some of them are more direct, some are more like, well, that's a similar thing they did, because we don't typically go and fight the Hydra. Do we have Hydras in Final Fantasy?
Yeah.
When do we fight the Hydra in Final Fantasy?
Well, there are quite a few dragons with multiple heads. In Dirge of Cerberus, there's the Hydra rifle as well.
Okay, so there you go.
Right.
I'm sure they're out there, but yeah, those kinds of I imagine those.
I'm pretty sure you fight a Hydra. I want to say it's in Pandemonium in Final Fantasy 2, but I might be.
Does Tiamat have multiple heads, or just the
Tiamat has multiple heads? Yeah,
Tiamat has multiple heads. There's a two-headed dragon in Final Fantasy Mystic Quest.
Shout out.
Yeah.
But yeah, I imagine some of those connections are a little bit more difficult to weave through, because they're not always going to be like full through, right? Because then it would be boring. Like, they're going to pull from, but they're not going to do everything. Well, you said sometimes it is beat for beat, but it's their own version of it. But some of those small ones must be a little more difficult to connect.
Yeah, they can be. What you tend to find is that there will be fun little allusions to things, but there's maybe, rather than being a plot beat or a plot taking a full myth or even a famous part of a myth and then following that beat for beat within a section of the game, you don't tend to see that too often. What you actually more tend to see is again, going back to Nibelheim, for example. Nibelheim is so closely associated with the concept of the underworld that there are parts of the geography, the cold misty mountain, for example, is something that's actually described within Norse mythology as the underworld of hell is located within Niflheim. But Niflheim is described as, it's the world of mist. But in order to actually get to hell, you have to go down, sheer rocky slopes and things like that. Or when you start to compare that underworld with, for example, Hades in Greek mythology, of course, there is so much water imagery that goes on around the Greek underworld. You have to cross the Styx. There's the actual 5 rivers itself, or in the Odyssey you have to cross, or Odysseus crosses Oceanus to get there. So when you actually kind of look at this from the Final Fantasy VII aspect. And one of the kind of key parts of Cloud and Tifa's relationship from Nibelheim is this promise that they shared together, but they actually do it at the water source of the town.
Right. Sure.
And the river Styx in Greek mythology is where, or the gods would make vows and invoke Styx. So it's an unbreakable vow, basically. So they're actually starting to tie in all this underworld theme that it's really quite remarkable. And again, you introduce Odin and the kind of the mansion Odin, of course, like being the god of death, or the death on the battlefield specifically, and then Rebirth just goes mad with the Norse mythology stuff. But I actually knew
the mini
I
games.
knew if far in advance Baby Seal had a shot of the game.
Yeah.
It was the section right at the beginning of the game where you're kind of climbing Mount Nibel. So he had a little bit of gameplay. I want to say something like 4 months before the game was released. But he sent me a screenshot of Cloud wearing the Yggdrasil armlet at the time. So I knew it was in the game long before it was ever confirmed.
Yeah.
But it was just like, you will not believe what's coming. And he was right that it took me by surprise just how much like on the nose the Norse mythology stuff is in the Nibel region in Rebirth, which...
I mean, how many books can you write? Well,
so I do have to release a Rebirth edition of the Norse Myths book because there's so much, but it kind of makes me feel vindicated because so much of what I was talking about in the book, actually, they've taken that and it now appears. Obviously, I will assume that that's just a coincidence, but there's...
I was going to say, no, they're clearly they read the book. Right. That's what I figured.
Why not? Yeah. Weirdly enough, in that scenario, there's quite a few things that happened that I wrote about in my Nibelheim Incident novella, which was released many years ago.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, for me, the way that I look at it is that if I was going to write it, I would do this because that's what I think makes most sense. So it just, if you're telling that part of the story, I think that makes sense. Therefore, that's what you should include. But I do feel vindicated that I was able to talk about these things years in advance of them actually showing up in Rebirth. But it's... I can't even remember the question. What did they...
Me neither. Just
yeah. So so yeah. The point is that I don't think when I talk about mythology appearing in the games, it's not that they have taken a full myth. Or for most of the time, there are a couple of exceptions, but it's not as if they've taken a full myth and they've just sort of one for one overlaid characters in the story over mythological characters. It's that they've taken concepts of locations or concepts of items or themes and built built a full, not even a scenario, just an environment around that, I guess. Is
right.
Nibelheim being a good example. Dirge of Cerberus is a little bit different because there's a crazy amount in Dirge of Cerberus that actually ties very closely into the labours of Heracles, but weirdly enough, it wasn't Najima that wrote that, so make of that what you will.
Yeah, you use it as a guide, and sometimes you use it as a blueprint. Sometimes you just use it as a name you want to steal. But
yeah,
I'm curious. I'm not, I know you're in the middle of a big project, and I'm not trying to give you extra homework by any means. I imagine you have other projects in mind, perhaps bullet notes. I mean, are you thinking about other games? Are you thinking about other myth, legend, folktales, other traditions that you might give a similar treatment?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, if I was to do this full time and work only on existing content, I would probably be able to write books for the next 20 years.
Oh yeah.
There's an unbelievable wealth of content out there in the Final Fantasy games. I kind of touched on, Final Fantasy VIII has always been a real love of mine. There's definitely enough content there to get a Norse mythology book out of it. I would really like to. I've got a kind of base familiarity with many of the Eastern religions, but I would really like to tackle Final Fantasy X and how that incorporates, the Hinduism, Taoism, Shintoism, Buddhism.
That'd be great.
The Final Fantasy 15, you could do easily get a classical mythology book out of 15. I think, depending on how my Final Fantasy 16 book is received, because so much of this will be looking at sort of Judeo-Christian themes. As I said earlier, I want to be as respectful as I possibly can, but I also have to prepare for the eventuality that it might not be received well. And I hope that that's not how it turns out to be, because I'm obviously not trying to offend anyone. But if it is received well and the community is interested in that sort of side of things, there's definitely a Judeo-Christian angle for Final Fantasy VII that I'd like to tackle. I've already started work on a Trojan War book for Final Fantasy VII.
Good.
So a lot of that will actually focus on Crisis Core, because Crisis Core's two halves is structured on the Trojan War and then the Odyssey. But there's so much that you could do, and that's just when you're actually looking at very specific themes. When you just start talking about generic mythological or religious allusions, you could do one for most of the games.
Well, I look forward to the day where I've got a bookshelf full, an entire bookshelf full of Mo Gallagher books.
Before we finish up, as I said at the start, I've been an enormous fan of you guys. Like, I have so much time for what you've got to say, and I love the way that both of you think, and particularly, how you bounce ideas off one another. And there have been so many times that I have just wanted to be a fly on the wall as part of your conversations, or even just sitting at the table with you. Well, I know many of the conversations have taken place remotely, but so I'd love to be able to come back and just have a more general conversation at some point. But because this one is being about mythology, I would like to ask your opinion, because I want to have your thoughts on certain things. So I do have a couple of questions that hopefully we can kind of round off. Just
love it.
That's okay. So from growing up, both of you are obviously very well educated guys. Like, did you have a mythology or a type of mythology that you were interested in growing up? If so, what was it and why?
What's interesting? I was thinking about this just the other day, knowing we were going to have this conversation, and I'd kind of always been interested in it. We did comic books growing up, and that's got a lot of mythology type of things in it. But something that was really formative for me, and we both had this teacher in high school, so shout out to Mr. Jacobs. Nice. And he was my AP English. He taught the AP English, but he also taught a course on mythology. And he was the only teacher I ever remember not putting down fantasy and science fiction, really encouraging it as legitimate literature. or cinema, as we might say these days, right? And I remember him handing me a copy of whatever high school version of the Epic of Gilgamesh. And that was sort of my first, because to that point I was in high school, so I knew Greek mythology a little bit. You know, the stuff that gets into pop culture, as we've been talking about. But actually reading the stuff itself and then getting outside of what was mainstream and him getting me into that. So reading Gilgamesh and then reading some Norse stuff in his class and getting outside of some of the Greek stuff. And I think that really got me a lot more into it. So shout out to Mr. Jacobs.
Yeah, Mr. Jacobs was great.
Nice.
I think for me, especially early on, it was Greek and Roman mythology because it was so in the zeitgeist. I really enjoyed that Kevin Sorbo show, The New Adventures of Hercules.
We watched that growing up when we were kids.
Yeah.
And Xena.
Xena,
yeah,
really, I think, stands the test of time. But that was also one of those, that show or those sets of shows were one of the things that taught me about how stories change over time and with retellings. Because then I would read about the labors of Heracles, and I would, then the original story, heavy air quotes, it was this way, and then in the show it's that way. So obviously it's not a faithful retelling, and I learned to become okay with that sort of thing. Later on, I was really interested in Egyptian mythology, and the story of Beowulf. Not connected, but like two different things, right?
Yes, Beowulf, that well-known Egyptian hero.
And his trip to Egypt.
As we all know. So those were the things that really stuck with me early on.
One of our schools had a whole Egypt thing, because I remember going through a phase there too, where there was like a grade you got into, and then everyone was like, okay, this year we're all going to learn about Egyptian mythology, because I remember, only for about a year getting really into that as well. So it's kind of taught in schools, or I feel like it's more like it's around schools and it's in the zeitgeist. And if you find a good teacher or someone, you pull the right book off the shelf, Mr. Librarian, right?
Sure.
It can spark that interest in you. That's why it's so great that I think that you're doing this, because it can spark interest in both things, right? People who love Final Fantasy, who aren't sure if they're huge mythology fans, can read your book and go, oh, I love mythology. Or maybe people who are big mythology people might be interested in how it affects certain pop culture, might be like, I got to try out these Final Fantasy games. They sound incredible.
I hope so, yeah.
The other thing I was real interested in for a while was Arthurian legend. And the Green Knight in particular, I found I was fascinated by. But also, like, I think Monty Python's Holy Grail.
I was going to say, I was more Monty Python, King Arthur.
I feel like
that's where I get my lore.
There's a part of that that's a really it's been so long since I've read any of it or even seen the movie, but I remember thinking it was a fairly faithful adaptation of sort of just going across, collecting the knights and looking for the Grail, and maybe not having a lot of success there in the end, right? Which I remember thinking that was really cool, even though they just ran out of budget.
Right.
Yeah. I think that was the thing about the Pythons, though, that they were very respectful for the lore, the Arthurian lore, because these guys, I don't know what it's like in the States, but it's pretty deep rooted in British kind of culture, although it's not common to find someone who is very familiar with the Arthurian legends. Most of us would know who Arthur was, who Merlin was, who, Mordred, or, the Lady of the Lake, and, how Arthur, acquired Excalibur. These are things that are pretty, just from a school level, that you just acquire that knowledge kind of thing. But
from what we taught, distribute and cutlery is no basis for a system of government.
Precisely.
Exactly. 'Tis but a scratch.
Oh, man. I know you've got more questions, but how do you feel about Americans doing general European accents constantly, because we find it so fun?
Yeah, go for it.
And shout out to Paul and his work as Ketchim, by the way.
Yeah,
And that whole
absolutely. Paul's an amazing guy.
representing.
I don't know if you guys knew this, but he and I met each other for the first time. We'd kind of spoken online, but he and I met each other at KuboCon in Birmingham in the UK, sort of a couple of weeks before Rebirth was revealed. Was released. And Paul is from an island just off the coast of Scotland, but he actually lives in my home city. So he and I live about 15 minutes apart, right?
Fantastic.
Excellent.
Most of the time he's back and forth from Los Angeles quite a bit. But as a result of that, we've spent quite a bit of time together and become good friends. And he didn't own a PlayStation, so his first chance of playing as Kate Sith was in my house.
No kidding.
That's awesome.
So if you were to tell 12-year-old me, when I first got a copy of Final Fantasy VII, that 25 years later, me and the voice actor would be sitting in my living room playing together,
That's
it would
amazing.
have blown my mind. So yeah, that was really, of all the mad stuff that's happened through my Final Fantasy journey, that's really high on the list.
Yeah, that's got to be up there.
That's fantastic.
All right, did you have a few more?
Yeah, so if you guys, obviously you kind of spoke there about your past with mythology and your kind of interests growing up. If you guys were to pick up the mantle and were to write a book about Final Fantasy and mythology, which game and which mythology would it be?
Okay. I think we're both one to go to 6 right away, just because we're such huge fans of Final Fantasy VI, though I'd have to think hard about, it's in every game. I'd have to think a little more on what there is to draw from. I'm sure as soon as you start opening up that can of worms, you find a ton of them. When you mentioned 10, that is something that I feel like when I think and talk about the entire history of the franchise, we talk about some of the games are more medieval and some are more modern. Some draw more on the kind of Norse tradition, some draw on these sort of traditions. But 10 is this weird, in the middle, kind of interesting. It's not totally medieval, it's not totally modern, it's drawing on different traditions and cultures, and everything about it feels strange. And so I'd have to do a lot more research, because I don't think I know the history, but that would be, I think, the fun, is learning about where the iconography and lore they were drawing on, because I think Final Fantasy X is just such a fascinatingly original concept.
Yeah, I would agree. And one of the things I mentioned earlier about the looking at the Eastern religions, but I'd also like to tackle it from a Polynesian perspective as well. But one of the kind of difficulties with Polynesian myths is that many of them kind of have the same core mythology, but because the different tribes and cultures kind of from the various islands, are so far spread, you do actually tend to get that, again, the details differ.
Yeah.
So it would be a bit of a nightmare to kind of talk about.
Right. Connecting all those dots. Yeah.
So for a lot of, and that was something that I learned, in my travels. I learned about Hawaii, and I already was living in New Zealand, and there are so many, because the Maori travelled from about 1,000 years ago, sort of travelled from the islands in Polynesia to New Zealand. Much of the Maori culture actually, still even now resembles so much of what's going on in the other islands, but that was it's the nuances that really kind of I got interested in. So I think it would be fascinating but pretty tricky to kind of hammer that down. So that 10 would definitely be an interesting one for that reason. What about you, Ira?
Yeah.
I think I'd want to find a theme and connect it through various myth, legends, folktales, and Final Fantasies. The one I've been thinking about a lot recently I was introduced to the idea of the anti-Grail quest. So the Grail quest is you go and you find the sacred item and you bring it back for the betterment of humanity. The anti-Grail is you take the Ring of Sauron and you give it back because it's messing with humanity. And I think we saw that pretty strongly in 16, or maybe you likened Clive to Bacchus. I was thinking of him as sort of an anti-Prometheus. Like the gods have given us their power, but they're using it to enslave us, so we're giving it back, right? So Noctis kind of does that too. Yeah. We've got the power of the crystal, but it's harming us, so we're giving it back.
Yeah. Ring of the Lucii.
Final Fantasy VI, right? We've got our demigod character, but when we bring the gods into the world, they lose their minds and they tear down Vector. And part of what we've got to do is give it back. And so I wonder if there is something to be said for calling it the anti-Promethean myth might have some negative connotations, but the idea that the power of the gods isn't always a blessing, and how do you either balance that or return it, because otherwise you get Emperor Gestahl trying to be the fascist overlord of the world.
Yeah,
I like it. That would be fascinating.
Yeah. I like that a lot. And I like those cross comparisons as well when you can draw a through line to the different games. But yeah, no, I like that one. All right, what else?
So conversely, is there any area that you feel is for any reason, be that culturally, be that, just anything at all that you can think of that you would steer well clear of?
I probably wouldn't have your courage to dive into the biblical stuff because I know. And it's sort of back to that thing we were talking about. The more modern people actually believe in it, the trickier it is, right? No matter your intention to be respectful or not, if you've got two different sects of a similar faith that have two different and non-compatible versions of a story, sometimes that's why people go to war, right? Cultures go to war over this stuff. So trying to talk about that without interpreting it, I feel like is a landmine you're walking through right now, I'm sure. And it just sounds very difficult to me.
When I was still a classroom teacher and would teach mythology, one of the very first things I would do is say, when we use that word in this class, what we mean is we are studying the stories of the sacred. We do not mean that religion is real and mythology is fake, because otherwise I would run into a lot of roadblocks real quickly. So I would want to, something I probably wouldn't even begin to touch is Native American sacred stories, because the white people came to this continent and we did very bad things. I didn't do it, but the ancestors did. And so because a lot of these folks still hold those stories to be sacred and true, I'm not interested in treating them as a story to be studied or to be fictionalized. And I've actually had to break some habits because D&D and various, I mean, there are going to be horror stories of or stories of skinwalkers or Wendigo, and those are sacred stories, and I don't get to say much on that.
Yeah,
whenever I've thought about that question, that's exactly where my mind has gone as well. I did kind of a lot of study or a lot of research into the First Nations and the kind of people of the Pacific Northwest as part of because the cruise industry is absolutely enormous in Alaska. Sort of looking at the First Nations of British Columbia and Alaska. And something that had never really crossed my mind at the time, and we're going back maybe 10 years now, that so many of the stories themselves are exclusive to tribes, and they're almost entirely oral tradition. So for you to record them is taking a snapshot in time that's not It's not how the tale itself evolves.
Mm.
And there's a very
It's like
strong...
the absolute antithesis of online purists who want the story to only go the way it went the first time. It's like
Exactly.
the pure antithesis of that.
So, and the story itself, whether that is for a tribe or a family, or there's a very sensitive degree of ownership of it as well. So for you to reproduce that story, without explicit permission is, it's a big no-no, basically.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I'm very much with you on that one. That I think if ever it was to be done, it would have to be extraordinarily carefully done, and with all the permission.
I would love for someone to write that book, right? Someone qualified and in the traditions, because I'd be very curious. But yeah,
but with the tradition, with the history of colonialism, it just makes it such a If things had gone been more friendly, there would be some room there. But because there wasn't,
I'm again, as a kind of white male European, I don't think it's my place to kind of say one way or the other what should. So I'll, as best I can, sort of when I'm writing and sort of pointing out these things, I do my very best to avoid opinion. I will more often.
I was going to
say
say earlier,
what was actually in the historic text.
Mm-hmm.
You were making a point earlier, and I didn't want to cut you off. I'm apparently fine with it now. But when I read your books, it reminds me a lot, because I read a lot of journalism. I work in journalism and in sports and stuff, and so it reads more like that to me, almost like you're reporting on the history of, and so I really appreciate that part of it. But I do also like to go back to something you said a while ago, the little speculative moments. I really do enjoy those. This could be a thing, or maybe I'm just having fun, because sometimes that's
wink, wink.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, it's with the Greek one in particular, it was a bit different, because there are so many sources, so many writers, so it was a case of, for example, the Phoenix chapter, like Herodotus said this, Pliny said this, Claudian said this. I'm not giving an opinion. I'm just, reproducing what is actually said in those texts. And the Norse myths one was a bit different, because the vast majority of what we know in the Western world, or the modern world, not the Western world, comes from a single source. It comes from Snorri Sturluson, who was a Christian living in Iceland in the 11th century, or 13th century, perhaps. I can't remember. But the point is that we kind of have to be very clear that is almost certainly not an accurate representation of what the actual beliefs were.
Right.
But of course, the Final Fantasy games are based on what we know the myths to be, so I can get away with that parallel.
Right.
But yeah, you have to be very kind of just be clear that this is what they say. And I think that's just as an example, the chapter that I'm currently writing is to do with the Book of Genesis and the fall of man, but it's from the perspective of the Gnostics, and it's comparing the God of Genesis with Ultima. But it has to be extremely clear that to the Gnostics, the God of Genesis is not God, the absolute. Right. He is the imperfect, inferior creation, the demiurge, basically.
Right.
Oh, so, man.
When's that book out? When's Mythos?
So you have to be, it's very much a case of Genesis says this. This is how the Gnostics interpreted it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not giving an opinion on that.
Right.
So kind of going back to your question, Ira, about how do we approach this respectfully, I think that is from an academic stance is probably the best way to do so.
Yeah.
But those were really the questions that I had. Is there anything else that you guys want to cover before we wrap up?
I'm sure I'll think of something in about 5-10 minutes.
I know. That's what I said. I really do hope this is the first of many. There's one thing I don't have a question here, but one thing I didn't want to forget to say,
Okay.
which was that I really, really appreciated your acknowledgement to us in the book in Greek mythology.
That's very sweet.
Warmed my heart. And not only that, but honestly, just your work over the years, and I don't know if it's any different where you're from, but where we're from, people don't always take video games the most seriously. And right. I think we've, as individuals, gotten over that. But still, every once in a while, you go, I just saw the other day, it's the 7-year anniversary of our podcast. We've been doing this for 7 years. We've got over 100 some episodes. And sometimes I go, is it really that deep? Is it really worth doing all that? And then I read your stuff and I go, yeah, it really is that deep. This guy's got a book full of stuff that also feels like a book full of other ideas had to get cut from it, which they literally did, the Trojan War book. And so seeing you, I guess for lack of a better phrase, take it seriously, is inspiring, man. Seriously.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I genuinely feel the same way about you guys. And I'm exactly the same boat. That I'm very lucky that I get to, once every 6 months or whatever, I get to go to a convention for Final Fantasy fans, and I spend a couple of days around people who absolutely love the series, and we can talk about it all day, and then we'll go our separate ways. And obviously we'll get to interact online anyway, but in my real life, I don't get to do this with anyone. In fact, I'm almost embarrassed to have a conversation with work colleagues to say I write books about this stuff. So when the time comes where I have to say to them, yeah, I'm doing book signings at this place, or have to go to a store to do signings or meet and greets, or it sounds ridiculous, because as far as they're concerned, I'm just a work colleague. So I'm totally with you on that. That it's almost like a double life at times. But what the quality of your product is, I've reached out and said this to you so many times before. It's so valuable, to be able to listen to your thoughts on things, and because you approach it from so many different angles, and you're as respectful as you could possibly be, and take as many views as you can. It is so well done, and it is very, very, very clear that you guys are really invested in this. You want to represent as many people as you can and talk about as many, broad ideas, broad concepts, from modern literature to movies to, pop culture, religion, when there are things that I like to think that I've got a fairly decent broad range of ideas and knowledge about various things, but you guys blow my mind, and the connections that you make, and I have personally listened to your Final Fantasy VII series 3 separate times, right?
Wow.
With the exception of your Mystic Quest series, I've listened to everything, every single series you have.
Wow.
And it is a joy. It genuinely brings me pleasure to listen to you guys, and I cannot thank you enough for that.
Man, we're gonna cry in here.
Yeah.
I'm gonna sign off before we get emotional. Say, man, and reading your stuff. Like I said, I think I said it already. I'll let you have that. I can't even. What do you say to that? That's amazing. That's
Thank
incredible.
you. That's very kind.
That is incredibly kind. We started this as an excuse to talk to each other, and I think our first 15 episodes had 10 listens a piece.
Yeah.
For years.
And I really just, I do think of myself as a hobbyist on this.
Oh yeah.
My job is a different thing. So
Yeah.
it's nice that some folks like it.
Well, from the bottom of my heart, I'm so grateful as I said, to have you guys in the community. I love it. It's my go-to thing, even just to relax to. And it's a genuine pleasure being able to sit and have this conversation with you. Genuinely.
Absolute same.
Yeah.
Let's not wait another 7 years to do it again. And let's dive deeper into everything. We got to let you get back to writing books so that we can buy the next one when it comes out. And so I'll do a close down and let everybody know where they can get everything. I'll have you send me all that information so you don't need to feel the need to plug yourself. I'll do that. But man, yeah, this was a long time coming. Let's do it again before too long.
Yes, I would love that.
Once again, we'd like to thank Mo Gallagher for coming on the show and also for just generally being awesome, for writing his books. And remember that you can find his books at any bookstore, most bookstores out there on the interwebs. They're unfortunately not going to be stocked in your local one just yet, but ask them. They'll order it for you. I bet you they will. And you can get the Greek myths that inspired Final Fantasy VII and the Norse myths that inspired Final Fantasy VII right now. And like I mentioned earlier, be sure to follow MJ Gallagher on all the social media stuff for your chance to maybe win some free copies. And keep following him for his future books about the Trojan War and Final Fantasy VII, and also Mythos and Final Fantasy XVI, something I am very much hoping we get to dive into deeper with him in the future. Otherwise, just remember to keep following us on all the stuff. Get over to the Blue Sky if you haven't done that yet. Not doing the old Tweeter machine anymore. It's all Blue Sky, YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok from here on out. So follow us on those things, especially the YouTube that we're trying to get up and going. And of course, you can always find all of our stuff right here on Patreon. Other than that, I can only ever ask that you continue to be absolutely awesome out there. You know that I will continue to be absolutely Drew Creasman in here. And until next time, we will see you out there in the world.